Hello, Bible Truth Seekers. Welcome. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 11 today. We're going to get all the way to verse 34, hopefully, but we won't finish verse 34. Would you pray with me, please? Dear Jesus, open our eyes and ears that we may see wonderful things in your word. You have given us your word to benefit our lives. Help us. Help us to obey your word so that we may live fully in your joy and peace. Deliver us from evil and keep us in your loving care. Amen. All right. I would like for you to remember chapters 10 through 12 all deal with the same vision. This is the longest continuous prophecy in the Bible. The importance of this chapter remember, it calls Satan to try to stop the angel in coming to give Daniel this prophecy concerning his people, Daniel's people. It details events affecting the Jews from the 5th to the 1st centuries BC, and it also fills in some details of chapter 9, as well as some details of the last three of the four nations symbolized back in chapter 2, and the beast of chapter 7. Now, some believe that Daniel could not have written this book because of the meticulous and historically accurate nature of chapter 11, suggesting that no one could have been privy to so many details of forthcoming events. Well, since God is God and since he knows all things, it is not difficult for the Almighty to make known the events in history yet to come. Read 2 Peter 1, verses 20 and 21. Messiah Yeshua proclaimed Daniel to be a prophet in Matthew 24:15. Therefore, we can trust all the prophecies given to Daniel. Now, the Bible is God's written record of his works through the ages. It is divinely inspired and is profitable and nourishing. If you've gotten my letter, you know that I've given you some scriptures there that I love about his word. Psalm 119, verses 105, verses 89, and verse 160. Also, another good one is Hebrews 4:12, and of course, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. Now, I hope you're going to be a little relieved. I'm not going to trace the accomplishments of every king, skirmish, and historical circumstance in this 400-year period to prove there are no errors. But there are no errors. This period of time was some of Israel's greatest tribulation, as they suffered at the hands of both Syria and Egypt. Now, the first 35 verses include 135 prophecies, 135 prophecies, each completely fulfilled down to the smallest detail. This period, remember, also bridges part of the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, why do you think this information was given to Daniel? Well, I think it was for the comfort and encouragement of the people of Israel who would live through the difficult days that it describes. Also, for all generations, that includes us, as a testimony that God knows the end from the beginning. Now, once again, Daniel presents a series of ruthless kings that are symbolic types of the Antichrist. Antiochus Epiphanes is presented as the classic type of the Antichrist. We will be looking at him closer in verses 21 through 35. Now, I hope you have your Bibles open, because if you like to take notes, and that way we're not going to be able to read every verse, but I'll give you the verses and then we'll read just some of the highlights. Now, in the first four verses, that it traces the history of 4 Persian rulers and Alexander the Great, giving summary details of the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. They were the two who represented the 2 major divisions of Alexander the Great's kingdom after he died. Now, in verses 5 through 35, we began to see a powerful struggle taking place between the kings of the south, that's Egypt, and it includes, if you'll get out your maps, the Ptolemaic kingdom encompassed a lot more than just what we know as Egypt. And then this is talking about the kings of the north, or Assyria, which is today's Assyria, which again included much more land than just Syria. Now, these nations were constantly at each other's throats, alternating victories. It was a seesaw kind of world of power grabbing, palace intrigue, and battle fatigue for supreme command of the region. And of course, the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, was right in the middle, which was fought over. Now, finally, a scheme was devised to put an end to these constant wars that were taking such a great toll on the people and their governments. Now, I want to lay out this plan. And let's start by reading together verses 5 and 6 of Daniel 11. Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. But she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. That's verses 5 and 6. This is quite an intriguing story. In 249 BC, Ptolemy II, the king of the south, had a daughter, Berenice. And it was decided that if she would marry Antiochus II of Syria, that's the king of the north, then this union would create a long and lasting peace in the area. However, even the best laid plans of kings and princesses often do not meet all expectations. And since it was a forced marriage, Antiochus II of Syria, that was the king's son, hated the arrangement. But he chose to live with what he disliked. But when the king of Egypt, Ptolemy II, died 3 years later, Antiochus realized he suddenly had a golden opportunity to get rid of his spouse, which he did. He divorced Berenice and took back his original wife, Laodice. Well, Laodice, doubting his faithfulness, quickly murdered Antiochus II with poison. Now, this ancient soap opera continued to play out when Laodice, overcome with jealousy, also had Berenice poisoned, along with most of her family. Now, in the end, of course, the hope for peace between Egypt and Assyria did not hold. In fact, this was only the beginning of the shedding of blood between the powers of the north and south. So, just as the prophecy said would happen in verse 6, Ptolemy II, king of the south, his daughter Berenice, and Antiochus II, king of the north, all lost in their struggle for power. Well, do we learn anything from this episode? Think about it. Now let's read together verses 7 and 8. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army
army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. Also, their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, he will take into captivity to Egypt. And he, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Okay, now, Ptolemy the third now, oldest son of Ptolemy the second, was not happy about the murder of his aunt, Berenice. So he immediately invaded the Seleucid Empire. His armies defeated the forces of the new king of the north, Seleucus II, who, by the way, was Laodice's son. Laodice was also captured and killed. Now, during this period, Israel seemed repeatedly to back the wrong empire and found herself being made captive first by one and then by the other. Now let's skip down and read together verse 14. Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. All right. According to Jewish historian Josephus, after Antiochus III, that's known as Antiochus the Great, overcame Scopas, a Greek general fighting for Egypt in a battle at the Jordan, the Jews backed Antiochus and in fact received him into Jerusalem and assisted him, his troops, along with his war elephants. Now that intrigued me, his war elephants. Unfortunately, this Jewish assistance was not remembered when his son, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, later came against Jerusalem. Now, if you look with me at verse 16, with his final victory over Scopas at Sidon, Antiochus the Great took the Holy Land away from the Egyptians for good. Judea and Jerusalem had passed from the king of the south to the king of the north in 199 BC. Now, verse 17, young Ptolemy V had entered into a treaty with Antiochus III the Great after his military defeat in the Fifth Syrian War. Now, through this treaty, Antiochus the Great tried to strengthen his position and expand his empire even further. Ptolemy V, that's the South king, surrendered his Asian holdings. He had some out in the Mediterranean along with some in Asia, but he surrendered those to the king of the north and accepted Antiochus the Great daughter, now's a familiar name, Cleopatra I, as a bride in 194 BC. Now, through this marriage, Antiochus the Great again sought to gain a foothold in Egypt through his daughter, but his plan backfired. Cleopatra I was a true wife to Ptolemy V, standing by him instead of seeking to benefit her father. Now, she was beloved by the Egyptian people for her loyalty. Now, by the way, don't get this confused. This was not Mark Antony's Cleopatra. That was Cleopatra VII, who was queen from 69 to 30 BC. Now, I'd like to skip on down and read together verses 20 through 22. Daniel 11. Then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. In his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. But he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. All right. Antiochus Epiphanes came to the throne in 175 BC with a program of peace. Ding, ding. Remind you of anyone? Remember, he's going to be a classic example of the Antichrist to come. Antiochus Epiphanes was a deceiver and a flatterer. He is characterized as charming, yet despicable and deceptive, a man of intrigue, and a person whose heart is set against God. He is also presented as a warrior who conquered and plundered and ultimately desecrated the Jewish temple by stopping the sacrifices and erecting an abomination of desolation. Antiochus Epiphanes, in his great pride, blasphemous actions, and hatred of the Jews, is a type of the Antichrist to come. The Prince of the Covenant, now, you want to mark this down, is a reference to the Jewish high priest, Onias III. He was the high priest at the time that Antiochus IV Epiphanes came to the throne. History points that out. He, Antiochus Epiphanes, called himself God manifest. But you know what the Jews called him? Mad One. Mad One. Now, a brother of Onias named Joshua, who had become Hellenized, changed his name to Jason, and he made a deal with Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, Hellenized means accepting and living like or in the Greek culture. Now, Jason said he would pay a large bribe if Antiochus Epiphanes would remove Onias and make him, Jason, high priest. So what happened was Antiochus Epiphanes accepted the bribe and forced Onias out and installed his brother Jason as high priest in Jerusalem in 174 BC. Now, 2 years later, now wait till you hear this. 2 years later, Jason sent a priest named Mendelus to Antiochus Epiphanes with his bribe money. Guess what happened then? Mendelus took Jason's money, added some of his own to it, and bribed Antiochus Epiphanes to secure the high priesthood for himself. Mendelus, of the tribe of Benjamin, wasn't even in line to be a priest, then returned to Jerusalem and deposed Jason, who then fled for his life. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes' double cross of Jason, it again shows the true nature of his character. Now, let's read together verse 28. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. Well, while Antiochus Epiphanes was busy in Egypt, a false rumor arose in Judea that he had been killed. Well, this prompted deposed high priest Jason to raise an army of 1,000 men and attack Jerusalem. His army captured the city and forced the high priest Mendelus to take refuge in the fortress in Jerusalem. When news of the fighting reached Antiochus Epiphanes, well, he took it, because it was always about him, he thought. He took it to mean that Judea was in revolt against him. So he and his armies marched toward Jerusalem, and he commanded his soldiers to kill everyone they encountered, men, women, and children, showing his unnatural hatred toward the Jews. Now, not satisfied with the slaughter, Antiochus Epiphanes entered the temple, by the way, guided by Mandalus, took the holy vessels, including the golden altar, the menorah, along with all the silver and gold, as well as the hidden treasures. His heart was set against the Holy Covenant. Now, go on down to verse 30. Look with me. This is another note I had in my Bible. The Ptolemy brothers appealed to Rome for help. Now, the ships from Kittim refer to the ships which brought the Roman legions to Egypt to help them fight. Now, as Antiochus Epiphanes and his army marched toward Alexandria, that's the capital of the king of the south, they were met by the Romans who demanded that he withdraw from Egypt. When Antiochus requested time, this is a story you'll remember. When he requested time for consultation, Popilius drew a circle around Antiochus with a stick he was carrying and told him not to leave until he gave his response. This was the original to draw a line in the sand. Now, the king of the north, Antiochus Epiphanes, was astonished at this display of Roman arrogance. But after a brief time, he said he would do all that the Romans demanded. Well, on his return to Syria, Antiochus Epiphanes tried to ease the sting of the humiliation that he had suffered at the hands of the Romans by taking out all of his frustrations on the Jews in Judea. His armies encircled Jerusalem and attacked. Only the pro-Hellenistic Jews who allied themselves with Antiochus Epiphanes were left unharmed. Now, in some of the history books, it says as many as 80 to 100,000 Jews were slaughtered. All right, now let's read together verse 31. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Antiochus Epiphanes' army desecrated the temple and stopped the daily sacrifices. On the 15th of Kislev, that's our December, the year was 167 BC, the Syrians built a pagan altar over the altar of burnt offering in the temple, and then placed an image of Zeus upon it. And 10 days later, on the 25th of Kislev, swine's blood and broth was offered on the altar to Zeus. Now I want to read verse 32. Verse 32. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. After venting his anger upon the Jews and desecrating the temple, Antiochus Epiphanes decreed that his entire kingdom should become one people. This is when he said each was to give up his own customs. His father had let people worship and have their own different customs throughout the land, but not Antiochus Epiphanes. The other peoples under his rule accepted his command, and many of the people of Israel also forsook the law and adopted his religion. He also commanded a change in all the ordinances of God. No sacrifices were to be offered in the sanctuary. The Sabbaths and feasts were to be profaned, and the Jews were not to circumcise their sons. Upon pain of death, they were commanded to profane the true religion, so that eventually the idea was that the law would be forgotten. Antiochus Epiphanes appointed inspectors to watch the Jews and commanded the cities of Judah to offer pagan sacrifices. But I want you to know, many in Israel stood firm and rejected the innovations of the king of the north. All right, let's read together verse 33. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Can we understand why this just tore Daniel up? Well, whenever Antiochus Epiphanes' men found copies of the Torah, they tore them to pieces and burned them. And whoever was found in possession of a Torah was put to death. Women who had their children circumcised were put to death, along with their entire families and those who had circumcised them. I want you to know, still many in Israel chose to die rather than to break the holy covenant. Now I'm going to read verse 34, but we're going to have to take the rest of this verse up next week. But I want to just introduce this to you. Verse 34. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. All right. As the historical book of First Maccabees shows, the decrees of Antiochus IV Epiphanes eventually led to a rebellion started by the priest Mattathias, and he had 5 sons, and one was named Judas Maccabee, also known as the Hammer. We will take up the rest of our intriguing story here in verses 34 next week. Now, we may only cover verses 34 and 35 next week because it's just so much in them. You just don't want to miss this. Maranatha.